When I was starting out in watercolour, I automatically reached for pastel tones, mainly because they looked so pretty. I really love those pre-mixed sets. But there's a thing about pastel watercolours, they're opaque. And getting mud, not the kind of mud I like to paint with, was an issue I ran into right out of the gate. My love for those pastel colours, however, has not faded. I like a good pink and I sometimes still use them in my work, even in portraits, which are one of my favourite subjects to paint and where transparency of the paint is quite crucial. Today I'm going to paint some full paintings using pastel watercolours and see what sets them apart from regular watercolours and if there's a different way I can use them to still make them look luminous and glowy. I've owned these paints for years, and while I'm very familiar with a couple of them, I haven't used some of them for a long time. For example, I do very often use mint, which is a light blue, in paintings, in portraits, to give the idea of cool light reflecting off the skin. And I also sometimes create my own by mixing something like a Naples yellow, which usually has white in it, with a Madder Lake red light or a permanent rose or a quinacridone rose. I have quite an obsession with pinks, not in objects or clothes as such, but since I have been painting with watercolour, I have started to notice how many beautiful pinks there are in nature, in flowers and in sunsets. You just have to look around to notice. But the beige, the mocha colour and the grey, I'm not as familiar with them at all. So I swatched them and I was totally using them like traditional watercolours because I went way too watery, and it's not a look that really goes well with these paints as they're not transparent. The light doesn't shine through them. So I experimented with going in a bit thicker, and that allowed me to understand and see the colours more properly. The layering and blending is completely different, and I felt like I was painting with gouache or something that is close to being a stepping stone or a bridge between watercolour and gouache. And if there are any gouache users out there and you have tried these, you might know what I mean. I realised quite early on into the portrait of the parrot that it's not as much an overlapping of layers in different consistencies from watery to thick. That does not work. You can reactivate the underlying layers much more easily than you can do with regular watercolour, non-pastel watercolour. But it's more of a positioning side by side of your brush strokes and blending directly on the paper. I have little to no experience with gouache, so my apologies in advance if I'm wrong about the technique one should use when painting with gouache, but this is how I found it more practical to work with these pastel watercolours. And it's easy to speak in hindsight because it was more of a learn as you fail situation. What I did learn was that if I did layer, I would have to go pretty thick on top to not lift and reactivate the paint underneath, which would have caused mud or removed the paint, which is lifting basically. And this is something that of course can happen in watercolour as well, but not as much. But since I found it harder to go in with thin layers with these paints, the risk of creating a bit of a mess is higher. At the same time, though, I don't feel that these are more difficult to use than watercolour. And it's probably due to my experience with the latter that I was able to kind of wing it, let's say. They remind me a bit of the Caran d'Ache gouache cakes, which I believe brand themselves as a mixture between watercolour and gouache. I do have that set. It comes in a red tin box, and if I remember correctly, it does say somewhere on the packaging that that is what they are. Oh, and by the way, these paints that I'm using here in this video are by White Knights, and I bought them individually in pans on a website here in Italy. This is not a product review. It's more me playing about and trying to understand how to use these and how and if I can integrate them more into my watercolour work. What makes watercolours watercolours is the question. Because if I have to be 100% honest, and this is my subjective opinion, my personal opinion, these are not watercolors. Not traditional watercolors anyway. They don't behave like watercolors, and the technique you have to use is different. At the same time, I know Japanese watercolors are traditionally more opaque than Western ones, like Kuretake and Zaitambi, for example, as they were more used for lettering, I believe. So I don't know, maybe I would call them something different. And especially for someone who is getting to know watercolors, I feel it could be slightly misleading. It was misleading for me when I started painting with watercolors and I reached for these pastel ones. It wasn't this exact brand, but it was a pre-mixed set of, I think it was skin tones, different skin tones, and I cannot remember the name of the brand. However, let me know what you think, or if it's just me being a bit too fastidious with words and definitions. But having painted with watercolour for years, I have to say something. I sometimes do miss opacity. I miss how alive and blunt a brushstroke may look, how it adds an immediate pop of colour, and how it immediately makes a decision. So there are areas where these can work perfectly and hold hands with watercolour and be best mates, but they have to come last. Literally, they have to be the last layer you add, as I said, to get those enhanced moments of colour, like pale light on the face or juicy petals in the last layers of a floral painting. And I probably am repeating myself, but they have to come last because they are thicker, they have to go down thicker. And if you put them before your last layer and then go over them, you're going to reactivate them and you're going to get mud. I moved on to florals and decided to paint this hydrangea with the pastel watercolours on one page of the sketchbook, and then with more traditional transparent watercolours that would layer in a more forgiving way to me on the other page of the sketchbook. Petals are very delicate and catch the light so easily that here is where the opacity of the pastel paints felt like it was working against me, because I feel I could not convey the lightness of the flowers and how delicate and weightless they look. And again, the light doesn't shine through the paint. You don't see the underlying layers. So building up intensity is something that I personally found harder, while I feel that I had an easier time with a parrot, for example. I really like abandoning watercolour now and then to remind myself of the beauty and versatility of all the other mediums. But I always like to go back to my favourite medium because it feels like home. I love watercolours so much, and if you'd like to paint with me and sketch too, I have a lovely online learning community on Patreon with guided painting and co-sketching sessions several times a month, live and recorded. We're always really happy to have new members, and it's suitable to absolutely all levels. My new Skillshare class is also now up and live, so I will leave the link to that down below. So if you're on Skillshare and you want to give it a try, you can find it there. Going back to my paintings, I feel the one with traditional watercolour is more vibrant and looks less stiff, so it is my favourite out of the two. I think calling these opaque watercolours or watercolour and gouache hybrid would be the definition that would make people clearly understand what they're working with. I'm going to keep using them as I have done until now to add those accents of colour to my watercolour paintings. Thank you so much if you've watched the video till the end. It's always a pleasure to share my work with you, to read the comments and to have a conversation with you in the comment section. So feel free to write away. And I will see you all next week. Bye for now.
times I convince myself there gotta be a heaven and hell. Once again you stab my chest, swear to God you're a narcissist. Never again. Through the fire, through the flames, that's how it burns when I hear your name. You let me down when I was high. Now I go first and it's your time to lose your head. Lose yourself. I spend my life building arms, see my home turn from castles into dust. Some days you both stay and tell me how I'm strong. So there I was carrying you around. All the times I convinced myself there gotta be heaven and hell. Once again you stab my chest, swear to God you're a narcissist.